It began with a whisper, an impossible claim that a photograph had breathed, not a trick of the eyes, not superstition, but a recorded moment that refused to stay still. In the spring of 1874, in a quiet Massachusetts town shrouded by fog and factory smoke, a funeral photograph was taken. The subject was a 9-year-old girl named Clara Nicholson, her body prepared with care, her pale face framed by ribbons her mother tied only hours before the service. The photographer, Elias Whitby, was known for his calm precision, for giving peace to the faces of the dead through his lens. But what he captured that day would destroy his mind and stain his legacy for generations. When the glass plate negative was developed, Whitby froze. Beneath the faint shimmer of chemical silver, he swore he saw movement. Clara's chest, still cold, lifeless, appeared to rise and fall, the barest ripple of breath caught between frames. His assistant saw it too. Others, when shown the print, recoiled in silence. The illusion, or whatever it was, seemed to repeat itself, no matter how long one stared. Soon, whispers turned to headlines. "The Dead That Breathes," read one paper. "Lowell photographer captures life beyond death." Families who'd lost loved ones began writing to Whitby, begging him to take their pictures as well. They wanted proof, some final, impossible confirmation that love might outlive flesh, but fascination became fear. Whitby's studio darkened, his curtains drawn for weeks. Neighbors said they heard him speaking to the photographs, begging them to be still. A year later, he was committed to an asylum, his mind broken and his glass plates missing. What remained was a single haunting question, one that scientists, skeptics, and historians still debate today. Can a photograph truly breathe? Because the story of the 1874 funeral photograph wasn't a legend. It was an investigation, a documented case buried in the archives of a world that was just beginning to understand how easily light could lie. By the year 1874, New England was a place suspended between progress and mourning. Steam and smoke rolled over mill towns, but inside narrow wooden homes, grief lingered like a permanent guest. Death was not hidden then. It was dressed, posed, and photographed. Families believed that if memory could be fixed in light, perhaps it would never fade. Post-mortem photography had become a ritual of love and denial. Photographers were summoned not to create beauty, but to rescue the illusion of life. The dead were propped against chairs, eyes sometimes painted open, hands arranged around favorite toys or flowers. These images were tokens of permanence in a world that offered none. Among the quiet tradesmen who practiced this craft was Elias Whitby, a photographer from Lowell, Massachusetts, known for his meticulous skill and uncanny ability to make the departed appear peacefully asleep. He worked alone, keeping few friends, his studio smelling faintly of ether and collodion. His clients trusted him with the final image they would ever hold of those they loved. On March 4, 1874, Whitby received a letter from Samuel Nicholson, a textile worker whose daughter Clara had succumbed to scarlet fever after 3 days of fever and delirium. The Nicholsons wanted what many families of their time did, a photograph of their child that would not frighten but comfort. They asked that she look as though she were only resting. Whitby arrived at the Nicholson home that evening. The parlor curtains were drawn. The air smelled faintly of lilac water and sickness. The girl lay in a small coffin atop a table, dressed in white muslin. Her small hands were folded over a book of hymns. Whitby set his camera upon its tripod, adjusted the light from the oil lamps, and whispered a brief prayer before removing the lens cap. The exposure lasted several seconds, long enough for silence to gather in the room, for every watcher to forget to breathe. When the plate was finally developed in the dim red glow of Whitby's studio later that night, his assistant leaned closer and let out a soft gasp. There, beneath the thin layer of silver nitrate, the child's chest appeared to rise and fall, a faint rhythm repeating within the stillness of the frame. Both men stared, unable to speak, and from that moment, the photograph of Clara Nicholson would no longer belong to grief. It would belong to mystery. The night the image of Clara Nicholson was born, Elias Whitby barely spoke. His assistant, a young apprentice named Peter Mallory, later wrote that the photographer stood as though frozen, his hands shaking, his lips moving without sound. The process Whitby used was common for its time, wet plate collodion photography. It was a delicate art, half science, half ritual. A glass plate would be coated with collodion, dipped into a bath of silver nitrate, and placed into the camera while still wet. Light struck the chemicals, etching an instant of reality into its emulsion. Then, while the plate remained damp and sensitive, it had to be developed immediately. There was no pause between capture and revelation. Errors were frequent. Ghostly blurs, double exposures, or shifting shadows when subjects moved. But Whitby knew every failure by heart. He had mastered the balance of timing and patience that kept illusions separate from artistry. That night, however, the illusion refused to obey. As the plate hung in the darkroom, the faint image of the girl began to appear. Peter watched, wiping his hands on his apron, as the form of Clara's face emerged beneath the developer's milky surface. And then he saw it, the gentle rise beneath her bodice, a soft undulation like a breath caught in mid-motion. "Do you see it?" Whitby whispered. Peter said he did. Whitby leaned closer, holding the plate under the flickering lamplight, and for a brief second swore that her expression changed, that the lips, once pale and still, seemed to part ever so slightly. The illusion lasted less than a heartbeat, yet it anchored itself in both men's minds like a parasite. He developed another print, then another. Each time the effect remained. The child looked alive, the pulse of her chest, the faint blur of her eyelashes. It was as though the camera had captured something that should not have been seen. By dawn, Whitby's composure had unraveled. He locked the studio door and refused to deliver the photograph to the Nicholsons. When they came knocking the next day, he claimed the plate had not yet dried, his voice unsteady. But Lowell was a small town, and rumors spread faster than chemicals in silver nitrate. Within days, whispers filled the streets. Someone from the Nicholson household had spoken. The photographer's strange reaction, the delay, the trembling voice. Soon, taverns buzzed with the story of the girl who still breathed inside the glass. On March 11th, the Lowell Courier printed a short but sensational note. Mr. Whitby's recent posthumous portrait of Miss Clara N. exhibits an unnatural vivacity, most singular to those familiar with the art. The subject appears imbued with some faint spark of life, producing an effect both beautiful and alarming. The line between fascination and fear began to dissolve. Locals gathered outside Whitby's studio, some begging to see the image, others crossing themselves as they passed. To skeptics, it was a parlor trick, a chemical imperfection misread by grief. To believers, it was proof that Whitby had glimpsed the soul in transit. But to Whitby himself, it was neither illusion nor miracle. It was intrusion, something inside the camera that had awakened when light touched the dead. He stopped photographing the living altogether. The curtains of his studio remained drawn. Only the red glow from the darkroom bled through the windows at night, and within it a man sat whispering to a picture that refused to die. Nearly a century passed before the breathing photograph surfaced again. The legend of Elias Whitby had long since dissolved into footnotes and folklore, whispered only in local ghost tours and forgotten photography journals. But in the autumn of 1972, a man named Harold Linscott, an antiques dealer from Salem, Massachusetts, claimed he had found it, the original glass plate negative said to show Clara Nicholson. The discovery came from a dismantled estate near Lowell, where boxes of 19th century belongings were being cleared from a long-abandoned carriage house. Among faded daguerreotypes and broken tintypes lay a small wooden case lined with rotted velvet. Inside, wrapped in brittle muslin, was a single wet collodion glass plate, its edges flaked and silvering darkened. Etched faintly on the corner, almost illegible, were two initials. E.W. Linscott, curious but unaware of the myth's full weight, brought the plate to his shop and displayed it under glass. The next morning, he phoned a collector friend and said something odd. "It doesn't look the same each time I pass it." Word spread among regional historians, and soon a small team from the New England Photographic Society arrived to examine it. Under magnification, they noted irregular patterns across the emulsion, tiny ripples inconsistent with standard exposure errors. Some suggested it might be the result of a layered or repeated exposure, an early experiment gone wrong. Others observed that the silver crystals appeared to have shifted in strange organic clusters, as if rearranging themselves over time. When the team projected the negative onto a screen in a darkened room, they documented a curious phenomenon. Several observers, independently and without prompting, described the same visual effect. "It's subtle," one analyst wrote in his notes. "But the chest, there's motion, almost rhythmic, like she's breathing." In taped interviews from that session, recordings now held at the Massachusetts Historical Film Archive, you can hear their unease. One technician laughs nervously, muttering that his eyes are playing tricks. Another insists that the image shifts slightly each time the light flickers, as though responding to attention. Over the next few months, more tests followed. Infrared scans revealed nothing supernatural, but the patterns within the emulsion remained inconsistent, defying full chemical explanation. A letter from Dr. Samuel Kerr, a photographic materials expert at MIT, dated December 1972, concluded, "There is evidence of spontaneous crystal migration within the silver nitrate matrix, though not at a scale sufficient to produce perceived motion. The rest must be attributed to optical illusion, fatigue, or collective suggestion." Yet, even Dr. Kerr later admitted in a radio interview that the plate felt alive in some unaccountable way. The investigation culminated in January 1973, when a Boston television crew filmed a short documentary on Linscott's find. They captured a segment in which the photograph was shown under projection. The camera panned slowly across the image of the small girl in white, her face calm, her hands folded. Halfway through the recording, one cameraman abruptly stepped back, swearing he saw her lips part. The footage was never broadcast. Then came the most chilling artifact of all, an audio tape discovered years later in Linscott's belongings. On it, a lab technician can be heard narrating his examination. For several minutes, his voice is steady, describing temperature, exposure times, and lens refractions. But near the end, his tone changes. "It just moved," he whispers. "The image shifts when no one's looking, but only when it's quiet." After that session, the technicians refused further tests. The plate was returned to Linscott's care, and he stored it in a temperature-controlled cabinet at his shop. In April 1974, only 2 years after its rediscovery, Linscott was found dead in his store, the result of what police called an accidental fall. The cabinet where the plate had been kept was empty. To this day, no verified trace of the Whitby plate has been recovered. Some say it was stolen by collectors, others that it disintegrated with time. But among archivists, there's a darker rumor, that the image itself resists preservation, that every attempt to fix it in light ends the same way. Motion, distortion, disappearance. And so the question endures, was the girl in the photograph ever truly breathing? Or has the story itself become the thing that refuses to die? 2 decades after Whitby's studio closed its doors, the story of the vanished glass plate had already settled into rumor, whispered about in photography circles, quietly dismissed in academic halls. But in the winter of 1896, a quiet man named Dr. Harold Fenwick began to disturb that dust. Fenwick was not a ghost hunter or a mystic. He was a photography historian at the Royal Society of Optics, known for his dry lectures on emulsions and the psychology of light. But his passion was cataloguing post-mortem portraits, those solemn Victorian images taken after death, meant to preserve a loved one's final calm. He called them emotional fossils, and his notes often read more like confessions than scientific records. In early January, while cataloguing forgotten archives in Boston, Fenwick came across a passing reference in an 1874 studio ledger. One glass plate, Whitby, refused, withdrawn. The name caught him, Whitby. The same obscure photographer rumored to have captured the breathing girl. Fenwick followed the trail through fragmented paperwork, receipts, shipping notes, incomplete inventories, until it led him to Providence, Rhode Island, where a reclusive collector named Malcolm Trask was said to possess the missing plate. He wrote to Trask repeatedly, requesting to view the image for scholarly study. Trask's replies were polite but evasive, until finally one arrived in trembling handwriting. "You would not wish to see it, Doctor. It moves when stared at. Not quickly nor obviously, only when you are still." That single line, Fenwick would later write, carried the weight of something neither man nor photograph could bear. In March of 1896, Fenwick made the trip. His notes, recovered years later from a scorched trunk, described Trask's home as a mausoleum of images. Every wall held portraits of the dead, infants with closed eyes, mothers posed beside the motionless forms of their children, soldiers restored to artificial dignity, and among them, kept under a dark velvet cloth, lay the Whitby plate. Fenwick claimed he did not at first notice anything unusual. The girl in the image, unidentified, perhaps no older than 10, was posed upright in a high-backed chair, lace collar framing her face, eyes open. A standard post-mortem composition for its time. But then, as he leaned closer, something flickered. He described it later in his journal. The faintest tremor beneath the collar, as though her throat remembered the habit of breath. He wrote that he blinked, adjusted his lens, even rubbed at the glass, only for the motion to vanish each time he shifted focus. He tried again, holding perfectly still, and the pulse returned. A soft, rhythmic suggestion beneath the skin, like memory trapped in light. That night, Trask reportedly locked the plate away again and refused to speak of it. Fenwick returned to Boston unsettled, but convinced that what he had witnessed was an optical phenomenon, not a haunting. Modern analysts reviewing Fenwick's surviving notes have offered several rational theories. Dr. Miriam Lawton, historian of photographic illusion, explains what Fenwick likely saw was emulsion expansion, a quirk of early silver gelatin plates that can appear to breathe under temperature change or candlelight refraction. Others propose parallax distortion, the subtle movement of reflection between glass and emulsion layers that tricks the eye into perceiving life. Yet even those explanations falter when confronted with Fenwick's meticulous observations. The journals describe repeated motion at consistent intervals, not random shimmer, but rhythm. And then, as one analyst notes, his drawings match none of the known distortion patterns from that era. At the time, the late Victorian world was obsessed with blurred boundaries, the edge between life and death, illusion and memory. Medical journals of the 1890s were filled with studies on hallucination by suggestion, optical fatigue, and the new science of psychological persistence, how the brain continues to see what it fears to lose. Fenwick himself lectured briefly on what he called residual animation, the mind's projection of life into stillness. He argued that grief magnified through the lens might create motion where none exists. Yet in private correspondence he confessed doubt. "I know what my eyes saw," he wrote, "and I know I was not alone in seeing it." That last line is troubling, because by then Trask had begun writing his own notes, frantic letters to Fenwick, claiming the image had shifted overnight, that the child's head now leaned slightly to the left, that the pulse was gone. On November 2nd, 1901, Fenwick's townhouse caught fire. The blaze consumed his research, his catalogues, and every one of his 312 documented negatives. Only fragments of his handwriting were found, half-charred but legible enough to reveal a final entry. The others were illusions. But hers was breath. The Whitby plate was never recovered from the ashes. Historians still debate whether the so-called breathing photograph ever existed. No surviving image has been authenticated. Yet Fenwick's account marked a turning point in optical psychology, merging the language of science with the vocabulary of fear. Was it light? Was it loss? Or something caught in the fragile chemistry between the two? The story of the missing negative became more than a curiosity. It became a mirror for human vision itself. Because in the end, every photograph is a kind of haunting, a moment that refuses to die, no matter how many times the glass burns. Nearly 3/4 of a century after Dr. Harold Fenwick's death, the story of the breathing photograph had slipped into folklore, a curious footnote in the annals of early photography. But in 1972 it surfaced again unexpectedly, in the most unremarkable of places, an antiques shop in Salem, Massachusetts. The dealer's name was Robert Kitteridge, a mild-mannered collector of Victorian funeral memorabilia, mourning jewelry, death masks, faded daguerreotypes. In early spring, Kitteridge purchased a dismantled estate lot from an abandoned house in Providence, Rhode Island. Among the boxes of glass negatives, one stood apart, its label written in a hand long faded, Whitby, portrait. 1874, Kitteridge, unaware of its history, placed it in his shop's front display. Within days, visitors began to comment that the girl seems alive. At first, he laughed it off, until one night while cleaning, he caught the reflection in the glass and saw the faintest rise and fall of her chest. He described the moment later in a taped statement to a local journalist. "It was like watching someone trying to remember how to breathe. Slow, deliberate. I thought I was tired, but it kept happening even when I blinked." Word spread fast through Massachusetts' small circle of photography collectors. The following month, Kitteridge contacted the Boston Museum of Science for evaluation. 3 analysts, film archivists specializing in 19th century emulsions, arrived to test the plate. They began under controlled conditions: infrared light, magnified projection, microchemical sampling. The emulsion, a fragile silver collodion mix, showed signs of age, crystalline blooming across the surface, thin fracture lines along the edges. Dr. Elaine Morrissey, one of the analysts, recalled, "Technically, it should have been dead, just a decayed artifact. But the exposure patterns were irregular, layered in a way we couldn't reproduce. It was as though 2 images had been captured, one slightly shifted from the other, creating a microscopic parallax effect. Still, the results were inconclusive. The most unsettling finding came not from the instruments, but from observation. When the image was projected onto a screen in a darkened lab, each member of the testing group at different times described the same phenomenon. She's breathing, audio log. May 11, 1972. Voice technician Charles Dyer. The image changes when no one's looking. You turn away for a second, then back and it's shifted, like she's exhaled. I've seen film ghosts, chemical burn illusions, all of it. But this one waits for you." The breathing photograph quickly drew attention from both skeptics and believers. The Salem Gazette ran a brief story titled, "Does a Victorian Girl Still Breathe?" citing anonymous museum sources who refused to confirm or deny the claim. Soon after, a team from MIT's Department of Photographic Physics conducted independent examinations. They found no evidence of deliberate manipulation. The plate's emulsion density map, however, revealed something strange: a rhythmic pattern of crystal alignment inconsistent with both temperature degradation and double exposure. Dr. Morrissey later commented, "It was like the material itself was trying to reorganize, as if it remembered motion." Yet, she stopped short of suggesting anything paranormal. Her final report concluded, "The illusion, whatever its cause, seems to activate under observation, an optical event triggered by the viewer's fixation. Modern experts now liken this to psychovisuospatial feedback, where sustained staring induces micro-flicker perception, creating the impression of motion. But even that fails to explain why every viewer saw the same rhythm, the same slow breath." In late 1973, Kitteridge began receiving anonymous letters, typed on old paper, warning him to destroy the plate. One note read, "Every man who's seen it ends up in the ground." By early 1974, Kitteridge had grown paranoid. Employees later told investigators he often locked the photograph in a steel safe, claiming it hums when the lights go out. Then, on February 9, 1974, a fire broke out in his Salem apartment above the shop. Firefighters contained it within hours, but Kitteridge was found unconscious, overcome by smoke. He died 3 days later in Salem General Hospital. The safe was recovered intact but empty. The Whitby plate had vanished once more. To this day, no authenticated photograph has surfaced matching Kitteridge's description. The surviving documentation, lab reports, tape transcripts, newspaper clippings, remains divided between the Museum of Science and private archives. Some claim the image was quietly purchased by an anonymous collector. Others whisper that it disintegrated from heat exposure, the emulsion liquefying into nothing. But no official record confirms its destruction. The rediscovery of 1972 reignited the same question that haunted Whitby and Fenwick before him. Was the illusion born from the chemistry of light, or from the human need to find life where there is none? The girl's image may have been no more than glass and silver nitrate, yet everyone who saw her swore the same thing. She breathed, and perhaps that's what makes the story endure. The possibility that an image, once given enough belief, begins to believe in itself. Maybe she was never breathing at all, the narrator murmurs. But the story was, and it refuses to die. Nearly a century and a half after that March afternoon in Lowell, Massachusetts, the story of the breathing photograph continues to drift through archives, museum corridors and late-night forums, half myth, half memory. What began as a tragic funeral portrait in 1874 has evolved into a cultural echo, studied not for what it proves, but for what it reveals about how the living see the dead. Modern art historians now categorize the phenomenon within the field of Victorian mourning psychology, a time when grief was ritualized and public, when the camera was both a scientific tool and a spiritual mirror. In their writings, scholars suggest that the illusion of breath, whether chemical or imagined, reflected something deeply human, the desperate refusal to accept that stillness could mean finality. Dr. Margaret Elston, curator of 19th century photography at the Massachusetts Historical Society, described it best. They didn't want photographs of corpses. They wanted proof of continuance, a suggestion that love had preserved something beyond the body. In recent years, technology has returned to the case. In 2010, a digital restoration team from Harvard's Department of Visual Computing simulated the supposed Whitby plate using 3D scanning and aging algorithms. They discovered microscopic warping in the hypothetical emulsion layers that, when animated, produced a rhythmic flicker, something astonishingly close to the breathing motion reported over a century ago. But even with modern computation, the illusion remained elusive. The rhythm shifted depending on who watched, when they blinked, or even their heartbeat. The scientists' report concluded with one line: the motion exists somewhere between chemistry and perception. Meanwhile, the descendants of Elias Whitby, long removed from photography, still guard their ancestors' name. In interviews, they've maintained that Whitby never manipulated his work, never pursued notoriety. One surviving letter, preserved in a family Bible, contains a haunting sentence in his hand: "The image took something from me that day, and I have never known what." Then, in 2012, a janitor clearing an abandoned camera shop in Lowell discovered a small, dust-covered envelope labeled simply Clara N. Inside was a fragile, half-decayed contact print, an indistinct child's face, faint lace collar, and what seemed like a soft shadow beneath the neck. Experts who examined it agreed it matched the era and chemical style of Whitby's work, but the surface was too corroded to restore. Attempts at digital enhancement only deepened the ambiguity. In some scans, the girl's lips appeared parted. In others, sealed forever. And so the photograph's meaning endures in tension, between science and superstition, between optical truth and emotional need. Was it merely the trick of a dying medium? Or proof that in our mourning, we ask images to do what memory cannot, to breathe for us when breath is gone? The narrator pauses. Perhaps the image was never meant to explain death, the voice says softly. Perhaps it was meant to remind us how fiercely we resist it. Why do we want the dead to look alive? Maybe because grief bends reality, reshaping what we see until memory feels like motion. Or maybe it's because every photograph is, in its essence, a contradiction. Life, caught in the instant it ends. The 1874 funeral photograph of Clara Nicholson, whether illusion, miracle, or accident, remains more than a mystery. It's a mirror reflecting the human hunger to hold on, to find breath in silence, to make permanence out of loss. Photographs promise that time can be stopped, that something, someone, can be preserved. But time always pushes back. The chemicals fade, the glass cracks, the memory warps, and yet we keep looking, waiting for movement. The narrator's voice softens to a whisper. Some say the last thing to die is the memory itself, and maybe, in a way, it keeps breathing,